Welcome to Now More Questions, the interview series that gets conversation started. In this episode, we will be discussing media freedom, or what's left of it, as the European Commission is working on a European Media Freedom Act expected for the end of the year. Media freedom is a precious public good and an essential pillar of any functioning democracy. And yet, policy and government intervention is more and more focusing on information control, fighting disinformation, fake news, or conspiracy theory. Is too much media freedom a risk, and is information control desirable? To help us get our heads around these tricky questions, I am joined by someone who has spent years researching and analysing international politics, communications, and contemporary propaganda, with a particular focus on war and conflict. He has authored a number of books, including The CNN Effect, The Myth of News, Foreign Policy and Intervention. He is currently co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. Dr. Piers Robinson, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
It's good to be with you.
So, can you first tell us about the Organization for Propaganda Studies?
Well, the Organization for Propaganda Studies is a fledgling organization established by myself and a number of other researchers who examine or are interested in the topic of examining propaganda. And at the moment, we're sort of slowly developing. Some of us have set up Propaganda in Focus, which is an online magazine publishing articles by experts on propaganda. And we hope as a whole with OPS over time, although organizing academics is a bit like herding cats, as I always say. So things are much slower than you always want them to be. But the overall aim of it is really to encourage both scholarship into propaganda in Western democracies and also to engage the public and also professionals. Because the underlying sort of belief we have is that propaganda is very significant and prevalent in Western democracies and very poorly understood. And it's very important, if we are to strengthen our democracies, that we start to study it and start to critique it and so on. So that's the overall aim of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. And as I say, we're a fledgling organization, but I hope over time, in the fullness of time, we develop research and output and so on, and strengthen from what we are at the moment, which is mainly sort of a networking communications framework. But also with Propaganda in Focus, we are sort of stepping out into publishing material. But that's OPS in a nutshell.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. So in the tradition of Now More Questions, we kick off the interview with a question from our previous guest on the show. That was Jan-Peter Kleinhans, Project Director for Technology and Geopolitics at SNV, and we interviewed him on the topic of the European Chips Act.
So my question regarding media freedom would be that, bringing it back to semiconductors, a huge question in semiconductors right now that governments are tackling is, what role do they play in the ecosystem? What is a meaningful role for governments in the global semiconductor ecosystem? So regarding media freedom, I would be interested in the same question. What role do governments play to ensure and protect media freedom, and where do they kind of cross the line to be too protective and actually hurt the media freedom? And how do we tackle that? How do we find the thin red line to do that?
In the first instance, I think, and this is a point I'll make later on, is that the problem definition is essential in all of this. And the problem definition of one of governments having to determine how far they need to regulate the media environment isn't the primary problem in all of this. That the primary problem that we have across Western democracies is the role of propaganda and the extent to which governments and also powerful actors employ propaganda. So whilst, and we will obviously spend some time talking about media freedom and questions of regulation and so on, I'd question the assumptions of the question in a way, that really the problem lies in the areas that I described. as opposed to this question of where does the government, as it were, draw the line with what the media is able to do.
We have today a media landscape that is very different to the one that we had at the start, especially of audio-visual, where you'd have almost just a single media outlet, largely controlled by the state. Today, we have many different news outlets, information channels. We have possibilities of live streaming events as they happen on our phones. And also then the advent of social media has changed a lot the way we are communicating almost instantly on things happening around the world. And at the same time, especially social media platforms have become almost the epicenter of concentration of power, censorship, and battles of influence. You spent a lot of time analyzing, researching propaganda. Would you say that today it is getting increasingly difficult to control information because there's so much out there? Or do you think that today's modern media tools actually offer even more possibilities for propaganda and information control?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think historically, I mean, when one uses terms such as state-controlled media, I mean, across Western democracies, the historical norm throughout the 20th century has been on not state-controlled specifically, but you have public service broadcasting, which of course is set up and ideally designed to provide public service and to be, whilst the structural arrangements are, as it were, determined by governments, by the state and so on, they're supposed to be independent. And then at the same time, you've had corporate media. And so throughout the 20th century, you've had big media giants, corporate public service broadcasting across Western democracies. And the idea is that that they're supposed to have a degree of independence and autonomy. But then, as you point out, over the last 30 years, since really the arrival of the internet and the arrival of, as it were, alternative information sources, social media and so on, you've had sort of not necessarily a transformation, but a significant shift in the nature of the media environment. But still with what we call now legacy media, which is the corporate giants and the, as it were, the public service broadcasters still being very, very significant and large and influential, but obviously being increasingly complemented or challenged by independent media. So things, with that clarification in place, we have a situation where there is, I would characterize it most accurately as almost a struggle between the legacy corporate media and independent media and free flow of information. And I mean, initially in the 1990s, there was a lot of optimism amongst sort of progressive academics that the internet would create this radically pluralized environment where where power would be challenged, where corporate media would disappear, where public service broadcast media would disappear and so on. And as the 90s went on, it became increasingly clear that wasn't necessarily going to be the outcome of the internet. And really, as I say, legacy media have persisted and they're still very, very influential. But the kind of idea of the internet being radically pluralizing, that certainly did not happen. To where we are now with what I said before is this kind of struggle between, as it were, the new voices, the social media, the citizen journalists, and the legacy media. And I think it is, to be absolutely honest, it is unclear to me where the balance of power lies in all of that. Because it is very clear that corporate and legacy media are challenged very significantly, and more people than ever, I think, go to independent media in order to understand what's going on in the world. So there has been that kind of very significant shift. But at the same time, technologies of influence and control and propaganda, point I made at the start, are able to exploit internet technology in very profound ways. So even if you have a situation where you've got more independent media, people don't have to go to the BBC, they don't have to go to corporate media or public service broadcasting media, they can go elsewhere. you still have, because of the internet and because of the way in which information can be gathered, use of algorithms, the targeting of people, and also surveillance, of course, post 9/11, bulk surveillance, bulk data collection, providing vast amounts of information to powerful actors who want to try and persuade you or want to try and propagandize you. And that means that it's unclear. There's this notion of where the question, where is the center of power? I think it's a continuing struggle. It's not entirely clear which side is winning, which side is losing. A cautionary note I would put in here is that an argument in favor to suggest that maybe the balance of power is sort of shifting, is still with legacy and corporate media, is, for example, if you look at the ability of groups to mobilize. So this is a crude comparison, but it's worth quickly making. If you look at the Vietnam War, and if you look at the emergence of protest and challenge and critical journalism, critical public debate over that war, really did emerge at a certain point during that war and increasingly challenged the American policy in Vietnam. So you had the famous, 20th century anti-Vietnam War movement, and it arguably had some effect. But if you draw the comparison straight through to, say, Afghanistan post 9/11, you do not see the same kind of sustained protest anti-war movement emerging that you saw, I think, that you did in the 1960s and 70s, certainly in the US and also globally. So, and in a way, you've got similar, deeply controversial wars. Afghanistan only ended, or we only withdrew from Afghanistan a year ago. But you don't see the same kind of sustained mobilization anti-war movement as you saw in the 70s. So that should give pause for thought that maybe, although it appears that we have a lot of alternative voices and challenges to power, that maybe it doesn't have quite the empowering effect that we thought it might have. Flip side of this, or an argument in favor that maybe the balance of power is going toward independent media, is, well, and this is something we'll be talking about later on, the extent to which there is a move towards effectively using legislation to control freedom of expression, the fake news, disinformation, misinformation industry. These are all indicative of authorities believing that they need to get control over what people are saying and thinking, which would suggest that maybe, as it were, the balance of power is shifting more. And we will also be talking about that further. But those are a couple of arguments there for sort of arguing one way or the other in terms of where the center of power is. I would best characterize it as a struggle, a continuing struggle between these two. And for me, at least, I think empirically, it is unclear exactly who's winning and who's losing in this struggle.
Yeah, time will tell, but it's a battle that we're observing on many fronts, and as you say, there is this battle around fighting disinformation, fake news, and the idea that the premise for intervening on this is that these fake news could lead to certain democratic outcomes. And there's a kind of a manipulation of democratic outcomes, notably linked to foreign policy intervention, for instance. So if you look at, let's say, the way Trump was elected in the United States, or how Brexit happened in the UK, a lot of this was associated with theories around fake news influencing behavior of citizens in a democratic process. Do you think there's a case to be made to ensure that media freedom is maybe a little bit curtailed to preserve public order? And in addition to that, do you think that actually citizens themselves are willing to accept some level of information control in a kind of social contract, a little bit Hobbesian style? I accept that you limit a little bit of my freedom to access information if it preserves social order.
Well, I'll answer the second part first. I mean, I'm sure that some people, if they are led to believe that social order requires some kind of control over free speech, that they probably will say yes to that if they're persuaded of that. And I also think that if people absorb what I think is largely speaking quite a bit of propaganda about, for example, this idea of manipulation of the internet being used by extreme actors in order to secure power, I think that's very inaccurate. So, for example, in relation to Donald Trump, I mean, we've had that argument made, but Donald Trump, I would suspect, achieved power because he had a huge degree of support, and he obviously still does. The same goes for Brexit and so on. So I think these arguments you hear coming from, I think, the liberal centre ground as to, we're losing control to extremists. I think this is exaggerated, and in a way they're covering up the fact that there are sort of very real concerns and issues which people have, which lead them to vote in a particular way. So if people come to believe all of these things, then possibly they will support this kind of control. But going back to the first part of your question, I mean, beyond the kind of core requirements that you cannot incite violence and so on, to cause harm or incite people to break the law, etc., those kind of basic fundamentals of the limits of free speech, no, I do not think that there are grounds for controlling what people say and do. And the first point to justify this, goes back to what I said at the very start of the interview in response to the question which was posed to me, is that actually the biggest problem we have is not, as it were, lies and manipulation by members of the public going on social media, spreading sort of disinformation, misinformation. The biggest producers of propaganda across Western democracies are powerful actors. They are governments and they are corporations. And this is where, if we were to be concerned about people being manipulated, right? Because that's really what is at the basis of that concern, is that people are being manipulated to think things that they wouldn't otherwise think, or to act in a particular way. Governments and big corporations are what we should be focusing on, rather than, as it were, social media and even sort of media output. So I think it's a misdiagnosis of the problem. There are, of course, in questions of freedom of expression, if you go back to John Stuart Mill, I mean, that there are basic, simple, very logical arguments to support free speech and to support limited intervention. Anything really beyond sort of, you can't incite violence, you can't incite people to commit to break the law. And the ideas are simple but important, and I think are very, very true. That you can never be sure that an opinion is right or wrong until you have allowed it to be voiced and allowed it to be subjected to critical scrutiny. So if we go down the road of censoring, of stopping people from talking about issues, it could be in relation to war, it could be in relation to health, it could be in relation to the environment, any such issues, or social issues as well, issues surrounding identity. If you go down the route of excluding, stopping somebody from expressing a view, an opinion, or providing an analysis, you run the risk of excluding what might turn out to be the correct reason. And of course, and Mill also says that it's okay for people to express opinions which are wrong, because then by doing that, you allow people to be challenged and to be scrutinized, and as it were, the weaknesses in their argument can be properly exposed. But if you exclude it and you bury it, you prevent that opportunity. And maybe the easiest parallel to draw with, if people think about scientists and how scientists proceed, is that scientists ideally don't proceed by stopping one scientist from speaking. Where that scientist cannot say anything because they have been deemed to be misinformation or disinformation. You bring the idea to the table and then you scrutinize it. So that is the basis upon which democracy, freedom of expression rests. And I think that basis is solid and sound. And what it means is that beyond the basic limitations on free speech, about harm, inciting violence, causing harm, and so on, we have to allow people to express their views, rightly or wrongly. And that is the way that we build more rational societies, more rational decision-making, and it's a way in which we also, as it were, protect ourselves against extremism. When you bury ideas, they can go underground and then they can get a life of their own. So I think I continue to be persuaded by John Stuart Mill's arguments. And Yeah.
And John Stuart Mill was making those arguments way before the age of the internet, way before even the age of television, but the arguments still remain valid today. When you talk about propaganda, I assume that a lot of people would associate propaganda with the kind of activities governments would get involved with, political leaders, authoritarian political leaders. Is that the case, or has the advent of corporate media also led to new forms of propaganda, and how can we identify those?
Well, I think in a way, propaganda has always, to associate it directly with governments, I think isn't entirely accurate, in the sense that a little bit of a history of propaganda in the 20th century is that, in the early part of the 20th century, it was seen by writers and analysts such as Walter Lippmann as a necessary part of democratic governance. And it was, widely discussed and advocated. But Edward Bernays, who's considered the founding father of public relations, he was considered one of the early experts of propaganda, and he set up the Council of Public Relations, because propaganda had got a bad name. It was seen as a form of manipulation, and public relations, of course, is seen as ubiquitous across commercial sectors. So there's always been this overlap between state, any powerful actor, whether it's businesses or government, and the use of propaganda in order to manipulate. So I wouldn't associate propaganda as just something which comes from the state, and that hasn't really ever been the case in the 20th century. But I do think, the general point that where you have a concentration of economic and political power into governments and into large corporations, and then you overlap with that the techniques of propaganda, which are well developed throughout the 20th century, Eddie Bernays and the Council for Public Relations, you have a situation where these powerful actors will use these techniques, and they will use them in order to shore up their own power. And I think that has been the reality that has been created. In liberal democracies, no one disputes that propaganda is a feature of the Chinese system, for example. It's known and almost accepted as part of how they do things within that political structure. But democracies aren't supposed to be subjected to that level of propaganda. But the reality is that the scale of the industry and the resources employed across both commercial and political arenas means that a huge amount of money is put into manipulation of people. So much resources that as I've argued elsewhere, that really, when you look at the imbalance between people such as you or I, or sort of small actors trying to influence what you're up against, really you're in a society which looks very undemocratic. And of course, some of this is to do with issues surrounding deception, manipulation of information. But it's also to do with sort of elements of coercion and incentivization that we see through propaganda techniques, trying to order people's conduct and so on. And when you add all of that together, and you add together the amount of money put into the public relations industry, also propaganda industry is another way of describing it, you start to get a sense of how deeply rooted these strategies of manipulation are in democracies, and how undemocratic we actually are, or have become over time.
You're talking about the amount of investment going into manipulating people. To some extent, we could not even be living in a democracy in that sense. And then it comes back also to the issue of trust. If people trust that the authorities in power are manipulating for the public good, that might be okay. But if you have a sense of distrust in that will increase your need to try and find alternative sources of information. And I wonder, how does this then play out for the future? Because one of the key aspects of this media freedom is that it is a public good. So somehow there is an understanding that some level of intervention is important, because you need to preserve the public good. Difficult to say who preserves the public good, but one needs to preserve the public good. One way this is being expressed today, for instance, is through fact checking. So the idea that, the media becomes a kind of fact checking body for people to better understand what's going on and make an informed decision. But then usually this fact checking is based on some kind of source of authority, which again comes back to the problem of trust. If you distrust that source of authority, you're not going to trust the fact checking going on. So how do you see that? What kind of governance structure should we have in place to ensure that there is pluralism and trust?
Well, in the question in relation to fact checking and the fact checking industry, which is based around this idea of identifying misinformation, disinformation, or conspiracy theory, as you highlighted earlier, I mean, those are all highly problematic and I would argue flawed terms. And the industry which has emerged and built up around fact checking, which the journalists then use, is one which simply becomes another mechanism of propaganda. And so I have direct experience of this myself in terms of researching and writing about, for example, propaganda in the war on Syria. Is you make arguments which challenge what your government is saying or the narrative that it's promoting, and then you start being accused of disinformation and misinformation. So whenever you have those mechanisms put into the structure, that they normally end up serving power. So you're just reinforcing the problem with that. So I mean, on this question of okay, so what should we do? What should be the objectives? The objectives should be to try to enable as much pluralism and devolvement of power throughout the media sphere, throughout the public sphere. Okay, journalists should not be seeing their role as fact checkers so much as their role in trying to help people understand the variety of positions that there are on issues. Journalists and media should be challenging this question of trust that you raised. Is that I understand it, but in a way, in a democracy, you can argue that our job is not to trust our governments. A journalist's job is not to trust his or her government. That actually it's our job as citizens to scrutinize our governments, to ask difficult questions and get governments to defend what they want to do rather than to trust. I think, if you go down the road of how can we shore up trust to make sure people believe government, well, I just don't think we should, we might choose to believe our governments once we have subjected what they're saying to rigorous scrutiny. And if we don't do that, democracy, without that kind of active citizenry, democracy can die. And arguably it has to a significant extent. So going back to the point about, how does one what approach does one take to structuring the public sphere? The idea of pluralism, the idea of having media outlets which are not, as it were, under the influence of governments, which are not under the influence of powerful corporations, is the kind of direction that we should be pushing for when we think about what we want. We should not be thinking about more fact checkers for the reasons I gave. We should also be thinking about, it's also to do with the public and having the skills to think critically. And, rather than sort of regulating or controlling for what some sort of loose definition of fake news, disinformation, we should just be giving people the kind of critical skills to evaluate information so that when they come across information which is significantly distorted, that they have the ability to understand that and see that. And so the idea of protecting people against that, well, I believe that most people do have the intelligence and the skills, if they've had some kind of background and introduction to questions around propaganda and media bias and so on, people can become very discerning and very good judges. And that's the democratic way of approaching this question more broadly, is creating an educated, knowledgeable citizenry who have the skills to evaluate information and then make decisions. And then at the same time to ensure that we have public spheres which are genuinely pluralist, which are genuinely diverse, so that people can be exposed to a range of opinions, so that we can hear arguments for and against conflict in the Ukraine, for example. We can hear the arguments for and against COVID restrictions properly. And These are all things which we have not been able to do in the last 2 years, 3 years, where I think, going back to your earlier question, I think we've taken a very dark turn in the last couple of years. And the levels of censorship and control coming from powerful actors is very, very high now. It's very, very clear to see.
So as the European Commission is working on its European Media Freedom Act, this seems very topical. I'm not sure they will be going necessarily in the direction of what you've suggested. But nevertheless, if you were able to sit down with the European Commission and give them your, top 3 recommendations for what could go or what should go into this European Media Freedom Act, what would those be?
Well, number one, and going back to the John Stuart Mill, if I take the point he's writing a long time ago, but a rigorous defense of the basic idea of freedom of expression. This is what underpins our hope, our aspirations for liberal democratic societies. This ability to allow and to tolerate diverse opinions is part of the fabric of our societies. And I think a rigorous, bold, clear defense of that should be the number one priority, that we will allow people to express opinions, even if we think they might be wrong, that we will allow people to express opinions which might cause offense to some people, for example. We need this conversation we were having before we started recording. We need to have conversations between people on the left and people on the right about issues surrounding identity, and we need to try to encourage open, rational debate and so on. So I think that's the number one, rigorous defense of the basic democratic liberal principle of freedom of expression, with only the most only the core constraints in there in terms of not being allowed to incite violence, etc., or cause harm. That would be the first thing. The second would be that media regulation needs to make sure that major corporations do not dominate the commercial media, because that comes with problems in terms of limiting the range of debate. And the same goes for public service broadcasters, that the ability of those two entities to dominate public spheres across Western Europe means that powerful actors through propaganda are able to do an awful lot of shaping and molding of people's minds. So I think working towards the kind of structure where you allow and encourage independent media, smaller media operations. And there is a literature on this, right? There is a literature working on trying to envision this Habermasian concept of the public sphere. The idea that we should public service broadcasting is okay, but it also needs to be supplemented by commercial media, which is good. But you also need to make sure that you have spaces for citizen journalism, independent journalism, so that you start to approximate more towards a diverse media sphere. And that should be in the thinking. And there are organizations, Media Reform, Media Freedom, I think in the UK, sort of talking in more detail about this kind of drive towards pluralism and openness. None of that's based upon regulation or control as much as it is about facilitating a genuinely open public sphere. The final thing is the point I made before. I think that media literacy, educating publics about the reality of propaganda in liberal democracies, and also giving them some of the skills to think through information which might be distorted and so on, should be a cornerstone of creating a citizenry across democracies who are able to engage, question, scrutinize, and challenge what they see and read. So I think that would be my third suggestion, and stay well away from some problematic notions such as conspiracy theory, disinformation, misinformation, and the idea of starting to stop people from saying what they want to say and what they believe in. That's the road to authoritarianism or worse, and it takes us away from democracy.
And it's much easier to label something as conspiracy theory than to actually start defining precisely what the terms are. And indeed, we understand that probably there's a need to have a more educated citizenry, understanding that probably in any form of communication there is a form of influence, and to be able simply just to recognize that there's nothing pure and perfect on the one hand and totally evil and imperfect on the other is probably a good starting point. So thank you so much, Dr. Piers Robinson, for having joined us and shared your insights on this complex issue, but highly political and topical. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That was Piers Robinson, co-director of the Organisation for Propaganda Studies. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for our next episode.